a rising Japanese finance executive, married into one of Japan's most powerful family dynasties. He thought he had found love, only to later realize that he may have been chosen simply to produce a male heir. In 2014, his wife gave birth to their son in London. 4 days later, his parents-in-law suddenly flew to the UK and produced an adoption application. They wanted to bypass the child's biological father and adopt their grandson as their own son. Later, a secret recording exposed the darkest truth of the entire affair. What this family may have truly wanted was never this son-in-law, but simply a boy. Once the child was born, what they intended to do was keep the child and remove the father. This is not a TV drama. This is a years-long custody and succession scandal inside the founding family of Mizkan, one of Japan's best-known seasoning companies. In Japan, sensationalist media outlets even gave it a lurid nickname, the Mizkan Stud Scandal. The story begins in Hong Kong in 2012. That year, Daisuke was in his early 30s and worked at the Hong Kong branch of Credit Suisse, a rising star in finance. He had graduated from Keio University, his career was going smoothly, and his future looked bright. But one casual lunchtime conversation changed the course of his life. One day, his boss suddenly said he wanted to introduce him to someone. At first, Daisuke politely declined, citing work as the reason. But a few weeks later, his boss's attitude became unusually forceful. He clearly told Daisuke to keep the weekend free because he himself would take Daisuke to meet them. This no longer felt like an ordinary blind date. It felt more like an order that could not be refused. Daisuke soon learned the reason. The woman was named Seiko Nakano, the youngest daughter of the founding family behind Mizkan, a century-old Japanese seasoning giant. Her family had long maintained control over the company's operations and was a classic example of a powerful Japanese business dynasty. The meeting was arranged at an upscale Cantonese restaurant in Hong Kong. Those present that day were not just Seiko, but also her father, Kazuhide Nakano, along with other core members of the family. Daisuke immediately realized that this was not merely a private meeting. It felt more like an audition. But things went more smoothly than he had expected. Seiko herself was gentle and gracious, without the aloofness. Often associated with a wealthy heiress, the two got along very well, and the next day, under the family's arrangement, they went on a one-on-one date. Before long, they officially began dating, and yet, Daisuke always felt a vague unease in the back of his mind. He came from an ordinary middle-class family, while Seiko came from a century-old elite family with a rigid hierarchy. He did not know whether he had truly been accepted or whether he had simply been chosen. As the relationship deepened, marriage soon became the next step. And before long, the Nakano family laid out 3 harsh conditions. First, Daisuke had to change his surname and marry into the family, becoming Nakano Daisuke. Second, he had to resign from his original finance job, join Mizkan, and start over from the bottom. Third, he also had to sign an agreement, waiving any inheritance rights to his spouse's estate. Looking back now, these conditions already said a great deal. What the Nakano family wanted was not a son-in-law entering the family as an equal, but someone who could be controlled. But at the time, Daisuke was immersed in the relationship, and he understood these demands as the traditional way a wealthy family protected its assets. In May 2013, the two got married. Daisuke changed his surname and moved into his wife's family home. But the reality of married life quickly began to suffocate him. The person who truly controlled everything in that household was Seiko's father, Kazuhide. He was not only the head of the company, but also the one who ruled the entire family. Daisuke later recalled that in that house, he almost always felt like he was being watched. To escape that pressure, he began volunteering for frequent business trips. Later, the couple briefly moved to Nagoya and finally enjoyed a period of relative peace. But that peace did not last long. At the end of 2013, Seiko became pregnant. More importantly, it was confirmed that the baby was a boy. For the Nakano family, which had no male heir in this generation, this was not only good news, but also meant that the family line finally had its ideal successor, and it was after that point that Kazuhide's attitude toward Daisuke suddenly took a sharp turn for the worse. At the beginning of 2014, he began openly accusing Daisuke of being a fraud. The trigger sounded almost absurd. During the matchmaking stage, Daisuke had mentioned that he had once won third place in a Japanese rugby competition. Kazuhide Nakano suddenly decided that Daisuke had falsified his background and suspected that he had entered the Nakano family by polishing his image. Daisuke tried to explain. He produced the certificate and even asked a teacher to testify for him, but none of it worked because the problem was never that certificate. The real issue was that Kazuhide no longer wanted this son-in-law. Not long afterward, Daisuke was sent to the company's UK branch. On the surface, it looked like an overseas assignment. In reality, it felt more like a move to sideline him. Even stranger, Kazuhide also forced Seiko, who was already pregnant, to give birth in London. Next, he made an extreme demand. After the child was born, Daisuke had to stop working for 1 year to take care of the baby full-time, and during that year, he had to find a new job on his own and eventually leave Mizkan. In other words, the family demanded that he give up his original career to join the family business while at the same time preparing to push him out just before the child was born. And even so, Daisuke still chose to endure it. He believed that as long as the child was born safely, there would still be room to save the life of the three of them as a family. In August 2014, his son was born in London, but the real nightmare began immediately after the child's birth. Just 4 days later, Mr. and Mrs. Nakano flew to London and produced an adoption application demanding that the newborn baby boy be taken directly into the family under their name. Their goal was very clear: keep the child, remove the father. Faced with pressure from his father-in-law, his wife's emotional collapse, and his own utterly isolated and helpless situation, Daisuke ultimately signed the papers. He later recalled that at the time he believed that as long as he compromised temporarily, he could buy peace at home. But he soon realized that things were nowhere near that simple. In the eyes of the Nakano family, his only real value was to give the family a son. And once that purpose had been fulfilled, he became unnecessary. At the end of 2014, Mr. and Mrs. Nakano came to London again. This time, they no longer hid their intentions and directly demanded that Seiko and Daisuke separate and eventually divorce. At this point, Daisuke finally began to suspect that from beginning to end, this had never been an ordinary family conflict. In order to find out the truth, he secretly placed a recording device in the study. Later, that recording became one of the most critical pieces of evidence in the case. During that family meeting, Kazuhide laid out the entire plan. With almost no attempt at concealment, once the adoption process was completed, Daisuke would lose his value. Next, the family would use its resources to push for divorce and then completely cast out a man with no family backing. Hearing this, Daisuke finally understood that from the very beginning, he had never truly been treated as family. He was little more than a chosen source of an heir. This time, he did not remain silent. He immediately submitted a statement to the Japanese embassy in the United Kingdom, clearly stating that he did not consent to any adoption procedure that went against his will. This move directly disrupted the Nakano family's plan, and the adoption procedure in question was ultimately rejected. After the plan was blocked, Kazuhide was completely enraged. At the beginning of 2015, the retaliation began. Daisuke was forcibly transferred back to Japan, and not to a core position, but to a logistics center in Osaka. This was almost a form of public humiliation, with the clear aim of forcing him to resign on his own. But Daisuke did not do that. He accepted the transfer, while at the same time applying to the court for a provisional injunction accusing the company of a malicious reassignment. In March 2016, a Japanese court ruled in Daisuke's favor, but even after winning this lawsuit, he still did not win back his family. In order to further cut off his options, Kazuhide even directly dissolved Mizkan's UK branch. With the company gone, the foundation of Daisuke's work in the UK was wiped out as well, forcing him to return to Japan. At the same time, the Nakano family quickly severed all contact between him and his wife and child. Seiko and the child were kept within the family residence, and even if Daisuke stood guard outside the door, he still could not see them. In April 2016, under the family's arrangement, Seiko formally filed for divorce. Daisuke always believed that this was not entirely his wife's free will, but within such a powerful family structure, individual will often finds it very difficult to truly exist independently. In the years that followed, what Daisuke faced was not only the family itself, but also the real difficulties created by Japan's legal system. In Japan, the system of joint custody after divorce has long been underdeveloped. In practice, the courts usually tend to award the child to the party who actually has physical custody, and this gives the stronger side enormous room to maneuver as long as they can create the reality of a long-term separation. The court will often rule in line with that status quo. That is exactly what the Nakano family did. They used money, status, and control over living arrangements to gradually isolate Daisuke from his child's life. By the time the case entered its critical stage, the reality had become this. The child had long been living with his mother and maternal grandparents while the father was almost never present. But the problem is that this reality did not form naturally. It was artificially created. During those years, the number of times Daisuke saw his son could be counted on one hand. The moment that broke him the most was when, under the influence of the adults around him, the child actually called his own father uncle. In 2019, Japan's Supreme Court issued its final ruling, finding that the couple had been separated for a long time and that the marriage had irretrievably broken down, and it granted the divorce. This result almost cut off Daisuke's possibility of re-entering his son's life through the Japanese legal system. In the same year, this scandal involving a wealthy family was exposed through the media. The public began to notice this case, which came to be known as the Stud Scandal. A major corporation that had long presented itself with a warm, family-friendly image was now being exposed as operating under such a cold-blooded logic of bloodline control, and that contrast quickly triggered public debate. But the exposure did not immediately change reality. Mizkan soon continued restricting visitation on grounds such as privacy and reputation, and formally dismissed Daisuke. By that point, he had not only lost his marriage and his job, but even the most basic connection with his son. But he did not give up. Because the child was born in London and held British nationality, Daisuke began shifting the battleground to the British courts. The British side soon issued a ruling in his favor, finding that long-term obstruction of a biological father's access to his child violated basic rights and requiring the Nakano family to provide visitation opportunities. But the problem was that the ruling ultimately still had to be enforced in Japan, and in reality, the Nakano family still controlled the child's living environment. In March 2021, a Tokyo court ruling reignited controversy around the case. The court sided with the Nakano family and suggested that by marrying into such a powerful household, Daisuke should have anticipated the special pressures that came with life inside a family dynasty. For many observers, that reasoning sounded less like justice and more like an excuse for power. The years that followed brought little relief. In 2023, the Tokyo District Court rejected Daisuke Nakano's damages claim over what he described as forced divorce and the deprivation of his parental rights. Then, on March 25, 2025, the Tokyo High Court upheld that loss, dismissing his appeal in the case over Mizkan's allegedly abusive reassignment order. After the ruling, public reports said Nakano spoke of frustration and deep disappointment with Japan's judiciary. By then, the legal battle had already stretched across more than a decade. Nakano had repeatedly turned to the courts, but the outcomes remained overwhelmingly unfavorable, even where he argued that he had been bullied through demotion, stripped of his place as a father, and pushed toward divorce. The Japanese courts largely refused to accept his claims. The family itself also changed. Kazuhide Nakano died in 2022, but the family's stance toward Daisuke did not soften. Control remained firmly in the hands of his widow, Miwa Nakano, and their eldest daughter, Yuko Nakano, who continued to lead Mizkan. Even after the old patriarch's death, the family maintained a tightly defensive posture. By then, Daisuke was no longer just a man fighting his former in-laws. He had become one of the most visible public voices, calling for custody reform in Japan, speaking at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan, and linking his own case to the broader struggle of parents denied access to their children. And after 10 years of struggle, he says he was finally able to reunite with his son in the UK. Even so, his story remains a powerful symbol of what can happen when family tradition, corporate power, and the legal system all move in the same direction.